joining us for, I'll start over. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Meet the Teachers meeting, our second one. It's going to be a short meeting today as we only have two faculty presenting, Heidi Parkes and Rose Allen. Um, and just the usual protocol, we will each faculty will do a presentation of a little bit about themselves, what they'll be teaching. Hold your questions till the end of their presentation, and please feel free to unmute yourself afterwards and ask the questions. The more the better. So I am going to turn it over to Heidi, who will be our first presenter.
Thank you so much. I will share my screen. I am very excited to be here. This is my first year teaching here with this group in Minnesota. And I wanted to share right away. You'll see this page a few times just to make sure that it's easy to follow along with, that I'm going to be teaching 4 classes and 1 lecture. And I am joining you from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, so kind of nearby in the Midwest. This is a photo of me by Lake Michigan with a quilt that I would consider a diary quilt. It's something that I added to a little bit every day for 100 days during 2020. And um, and I love rabbits. You might see a few of those in the presentation. So this is me again in Milwaukee. I love living in the city. I love sewing everywhere, even when we were waiting for people to log in. And when I'm watching Rose's presentation, I'll be sewing and having my handwork out. And that's one of the things I love to focus on, is an ability to sew anywhere and to make the most of your time. One of the fun things that I did this past year is an artist residency. For a year, I was the artist in residence at the historic Pfister Hotel in downtown Milwaukee. And here you can see some great examples of the things that I'm going to be teaching. On the 2 far sides, I've got some framed quilts. So they are quilts that are stretched around a wooden frame, and that's one of the classes I'm teaching. I will also be teaching improvisational hand quilting. So all of these quilts on the wall are hand quilted, and you can see that sometimes I leave loose knots visible, and I play with different thicknesses of thread. This one above me, in fact, is quilted partly with yarn and also partly with sewing machine thread, and largely with pearl cotton size 8, which is my very favorite kind of thread to quilt with. And some of us were talking even as we were logging in that we're excited for QuiltCon this year. So I'm going to be exhibiting 4 quilts at QuiltCon. I taught there for a long time, from 2017 through 2023. And now I feel like I'm kind of an alum from teaching. So I won't be teaching at QuiltCon, but these quilts will be there if you are perhaps there and eager to take a peek in person. And this is one of those quilts. And these are the beautiful blue walls that I got to have at my studio in at the Pfister. This is a quilt that is partly machine pieced and partly hand pieced. And those are the 2 other classes that I'm excited to highlight for you. So I'm teaching a visible hand piecing class, which is a shorter class, and that teaches some different kinds of applique. These are little bits of hand applique in here. That's what I'll be doing during Rose's presentation as well, as some hand applique. And then this quilt also has lots and lots of piecing in it. And I'm going to be sharing about scrap quilts. And my scrap quilting class is about combining machine and hand piecing. This is all just circle applique. It's a calendar of 2021. So it starts out with January in the top and loops its way down, and was a fun way for me to investigate the year. And then it has a lot of dense and complex hand quilting on it, which is very much part of that improvisational hand quilting idea. And then this quilt was just recently in Quilt National. So I got it back after touring around for 2 years, and now it's going to be in QuiltCon. And this is another quilt that I would consider a diary quilt, but also that has a lot of visible hand piecing in it. And of course, it is hand quilted. It's fairly simple hand quilting with the lines going straight across. But some of the very important things to consider with hand quilting is spacing, ergonomics for your body, and choosing the thread color. I also happen to be wearing a quilted tank top in all of these photos, which is a garment that I love to wear. This coming year, this quilt will be at Quilt National. And again, it's got a lot of visible hand piecing in it. And then I'm very excited, kind of in the Minnesota neck of the woods, I'm going to have an exhibition at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Art called Soft Magic from March through June. So it's kind of exciting that I will have the quilts back from that show. By the time I'm teaching with all of you later in June, I'm going to be driving. So I'll bring a nice big suitcase full of quilts to share because I love having some quilts to look at in person that are exemplifying the ideas of the class. So things will be back home from being in that exhibition. So this one, again, is a lot of visible hand piecing in it. So the first class that we're going to look at in depth is scrap quilting. And you might have recognized this magazine at Joann Fabrics and Barnes and Noble a few years ago. I was in Threads magazine with one of my scrap quilts. And so here you can see me holding the whole quilt up. And it's an investigation for me of the scraps that I happen to make when I'm working on other things. And in particular, I like to back my quilts with wide yardage of unbleached cotton muslin. And then I ended up with these long, skinny strips that are 2 or 3 inches wide by 20 feet long, and I have to figure out something to do with them. And here you can see I've got a little bit of an IKEA curtain and some circles, some other funny shapes that I was trying to work out. So here you can see that it's a quilt top, and I frequently like using the color white for these because then I don't have to think too much about the color, but I've seen beautiful colors, beautiful versions of quilts from these classes that are monochromatic with colors like purple or blue, and also very beautiful versions that are done with a variety of colors. And those are things that we'll talk about in class as well. So as I was saying, I like sewing anywhere and everywhere. So here I am on an airplane working on some blocks for these scrap quilts. And then here you can see the quilt top. And I like to add a little bit of, or a sheet of blue fabric underneath them to create a really beautiful shadow effect where the seams are. So here, mostly I iron my seams open to the side, and that area then kind of glows behind the quilt. And this is just a sweet little video showing some of those scrap quilting techniques. So it doesn't have to be a perfect block. It can be kind of a complicated shape. And there are a lot of ways to stick them together with applique techniques and piecing. And it's just a fun little window into class. These are some scrap quilts made by students. So you can see here we were very happy at an exhibition, and this quilt's made with all kinds of colors. This is another wonderful quilt made with lots of colors. I recently taught this to a guild out in Virginia, and this was a quilt made by a student there with a lot of warm colors. So don't feel that you have to stick with white the way that I did. And then in the scrap quilting class and all of my classes, you are going to get a little bit of pre-recorded information in advance. So you'll be able to see some videos and PowerPoints from me in advance. They're optional if you are just not a tech person and that's why you're coming to a class in the flesh. It is okay if you don't watch all of the video in advance, but you will have access to that. And it can be a lot of fun because, for example, you can make a lot of these little moments of piecing like what I was doing here on the airplane. And then I can talk you through that more challenging, piecing them together and fitting them all in one place. So that's part of why it can be fun to have a head start, and why you might be able to potentially even complete your quilt top while you're with me in person because of that head start. The next class I'd like to share about is visible hand piecing. And this is a shorter class. You'll see it's just in the morning. And I like to use a combination of the ladder stitch, whip stitch, and running stitch. And I share a lot of fun techniques in that class. It is particularly wonderful for beginners to be in the visible hand piecing class. I share a lot of examples. I talk about how to get your stitches the length that you want and how to get the angles that are really satisfying. So it is a very popular class, especially a few years ago. I taught that class at Sisters out in Oregon, and folks really loved having this class in person there in that same 3-hour time frame. Next up, I'm going to be doing a lecture on hand yoga, and thought we could all try along for a moment. I'll just share my very favorite fast sequence with you. And then in person, we will do more together. So if you take your palms together and then gently flex from side to side, this can be a great stretch for your wrists. And then we'll shift and move forward and back. And ideally, these aren't going to be really painful, big stretches. So next we'll twist side to side. But if you do feel it a lot in your body, it can be like that canary in the coal mine to say, oh, that move in particular, you might want to do a little bit more often. Now we'll keep our wrists steady, but we're going to open our hands wide and then return to that mitten hand. This one, especially if you get a little bit of a trigger finger from gripping your quilt too tight, like I did a few years ago, this is really lovely for that. And then next we will balloon our hands wide, keeping the fingers together, and return. And now we'll keep our palms together and spread our fingers. This can look different on different people, but ideally you're keeping those joints together and then just stretching the fingers. So it's the opposite of what we were doing, keeping the tips of the fingers together. And then we can gently dust off our hands as though we were busy baking a cake. Good for circulation. And there's a lot more where that came from, and it'll be a pretty interactive lecture in the beginning with a lot of things that you can do that you'll get to feel, especially helpful in the middle of our time together to rest your hands after you've been busy sewing. And then there'll be a nice Q&A where I share some more particular insights about hands and respond to questions. Then we'll do a class called A Framed Quilt in a Day, and this might be one of my very most popular classes. It's a class that I love to teach as a full day class. You can anticipate walking away with a finished framed quilt. I suggest a 6-inch by 6-inch frame, but you are welcome to purchase any frames that you want. And then especially since you'll again have access to that pre-recorded class in advance, you might want to buy a 6-pack of frames. I have them linked on my Amazon shop. You can also usually get them pretty easily at places like Michael's and Joann Fabrics, which needs our support these days. And I always leave the canvas on there. It actually adds to the archival quality of it. It allows it to last a little bit longer. And we'll learn a variety of different techniques for working here. So I'll share about quilting, embroidery, layering, piecing, and most importantly, using a staple gun to finish our quilts. So these are a few more examples of student work. And especially if you like Pinterest, I keep trying to have my interns help me add images from Instagram to my Pinterest boards so that you can easily see a lot of student examples of finished work all in one go. And then the very last class that I'm excited to be talking about is improv hand quilting. So here you can see me. I am not at my artist residency with blue walls. I am back at home in my very beloved home studio, my favorite place to work, even though airplanes might be my second favorite place to work. And here you can see a little bit of my quilt rack where I store quilts, my ironing board that I use once in a while, and then this is one of my favorite ways to set myself up quilting. You can see that I quilt not with a frame, not with a hoop, but working off the edge of a table. So I'll be teaching you that technique because that's how I like to quilt. And I'll be sharing a variety of ways to work with thimbles to protect your hands. I'm a certified yoga instructor, and also I overdid it a little bit with my finger and using a thimble that was not very ergonomic for me back in 2017, and that sent me to occupational therapy. And then I learned a lot of best practice things from occupational therapy. So especially when I'm teaching repetitive things for your body, like hand quilting, I always try to tie that in with the tips and best practices that have worked for me. And I also try very much, and this is the real plus of learning this class in person, is I try to spend a lot of time equally moving around the room with each student to see how it's working using your thimble, right? You're wearing it, but are you using it? And is my combination of thimble on my end, um, is my combination working, or is a different combination going to be better for you? I like the analogy that the pushing thimble that I personally use on my ring finger is like a hammer to push the needle into the quilt. And then on the other side, on my index finger, you could also use your thumb, I use a gripping thimble, a pulling thimble that's like a tweezers to help, or not a tweezers, a pliers to help pull that needle through to the other side. And both sides of that equation need some attention. But also, you would never try to insert a nail into the wall using pliers. And if you're not using a thimble or something to help push like a hammer, you really are trying to do the work. Physics is not on your side if you're not using a thimble. And long term, that can cause hand problems for folks. So I try to be a real teammate in brainstorming a variety of ways to quilt. And I'm right-handed, but I also demo left-handed. And I demo using a thimble on your index finger, your middle finger, and your ring finger, because hopefully one of those will be a good fit for you. And while I can do all of them, I definitely prefer personally to push with my ring finger. So here you can see that setup of my gripping finger and my pushing finger. And I do baste with safety pins, so that will be part of the class as well. Here's just another little bit of me quilting off the edge of the table and my beloved pearl cotton size 8, usually from DMC. And this is, I think, a really fun example of what improv quilting can do for you. This is a quilt top that I challenged myself to piece by hand in 3 hours. I made a little time-lapse video of myself piecing this quilt in 3 hours. And it wasn't quite singing with excitement at that point. And so then I spent about 20 hours quilting it. And I really love what I was able to do to activate the composition with the quilting. So this is the type of thing that we'll be talking about in addition to easy, fun, carefree, straight parallel lines on your quilt, which there's very much a place for both, certainly in my own practice. So one more example of hand quilting. And I do, hide my knots sometimes too. That one was a close-up with exposed knots, but I share both how I hide my knots when I want to, and I also share a little bit about why I like to celebrate showing my work and having that visual punctuation of a visible knot at other times as well. So, um, those are the classes that I'll be teaching. In the meantime, I would love it if you followed along with me. I'm on Instagram, Pinterest, YouTube. I have a monthly email newsletter, and I teach on Creative Bug. I even have some fun short classes like for making a needle carrying case, which is actually my favorite way to bind a quilt. So it's kind of a 2-for-1 class there. But that'll, if I'm new to you, because I know this is the first time I've taught at this show, it'll be a chance where you can get to know a little bit more about my teaching style, and hopefully I'll win you over that you would enjoy taking a class from me. And then lastly, I always get a lot of questions about supplies, and we have a nice supply list already provided in the description. But you can see even more about my favorite supplies on my website at this favorite supplies page. And you'll notice a theme. If you look up my name, Heidi Parkes, and you get the E in Parks, you can find me just about anywhere. So thank you very much, everyone, for letting me share with you about the quilting that I like to do. And I hope I'm very, very excited to see everyone in June.
Thank you very much, Heidi. That was really interesting. Um, just out of curiosity, how did you get drawn into handwork as opposed to machine work?
So originally I was machine piecing quilts. I started doing that officially with fabric in 2013. Before that, I had made quilts out of book pages, and I made a backdrop for a set for a school play that was a 50-foot wide quilt. But quilting with fabric and thread and machine piecing, I started doing in 2013, and I had been a high school art teacher for 9 years. By the end of that year in September, I quit my job to become a full-time quilter. I just like the fire had been lit inside of me. And then by the end of by like in early 2015, I went to Seoul in South Korea, and I took some classes on Korean patchwork. And I was just blown away by the idea that piecing could be visible instead of
Mhm.
invisible. And up until that point, I had been telling myself the story that like I needed to keep my prices accessible, and I couldn't afford, and my customer couldn't afford for me to be like piecing things by hand because it was too slow. And then when I saw that visible hand piecing, it made me think, oh, well, if you can see obviously that it was hand pieced, then I can justify spending a little bit more time on it. And so since that time, I have been playing and experimenting with a lot of ways to both use embroidery and visible hand piecing on my quilts. And especially at the time, I was using an old hand-me-down sewing machine, and did not have a lift and lower desk like I have now for ergonomics. So
Mhm.
my low back would hurt, and I didn't like that the sewing machine was loud. Back in those days, we didn't all have earbuds, so the wire would catch on things. And now, like that blue quilt and my scrap quilts, I've been returning to doing some machine piecing because I have a fancy Janome HD9 Black Edition that I really like. But I love how it feels in my body to be sewing by hand. And I
Mhm.
enjoy bringing things to meetings when I'm traveling, anytime I'm a passenger on a road trip. I get to watch marathon TV when I'm quilting by hand, but usually I stick to audiobooks when I'm machine piecing. So it's just, yeah, listening to my body and being really deeply inspired by Korean patchwork. It's a wonderful question. Thank you.
Sure. No, I'm fascinated by it. It's definitely paid off. You do beautiful work. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Does
And
anyone else
you.
does anyone else in the audience have a question? Please feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. No, another quiet audience tonight. Okay, well, thank you, Heidi, and we'll move on to Rose.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Okay, all right. Hi, I'm
perfect.
Rose Allen. Um, I'm a member of Minnesota Quilters, have been involved with the show for many years and with the organization. Um, and I have been teaching beginners for probably 12 years now. Um, I'm teaching them all the stuff that I have kind of learned from going to a lot of classes and studying with a lot of different quilters. And these are kind of the techniques that I have found work to provide some success. And so I have put together for the show 4 1-hour sessions for the absolute novice quilter. These are for people that are exploring the concept. They may not even have tried cutting fabric. So we we're going to be focusing on that audience and also on people that perhaps haven't had any formal training and want to learn a little bit more about some of the techniques that work. So um, I'm real excited about this. We did it last year when we were in Duluth, and we're repeating it again. So if you are a novice quilter, consider joining for 1 hour, one of the sessions. If you are a quilter who's bringing friends to the show, you may want to encourage them to spend an hour learning some of the real basics of the craft of quilting. You can register ahead of time, but you also probably, if there's space available in the class, still get a space that day. You don't have to bring anything but you. There will be fabric and tools and machines and any kind of handouts that are involved with it that'll be available for you. So it's an opportunity to kind of see what this quilting business is all about. So let me share my screen and I will show you um, a little bit about okay, share, okay,
There you go.
okay. All right. Um, the first session that I'm doing is called piecing, or no, actually, I'm sorry, this is, well, yeah, oh, I'm gonna have to,
You may have skipped ahead one.
I skipped ahead one slide, sorry, when we
There
were,
you go.
okay. So preparing your fabric for quilting. Fabric, comes from a bolt, but there's some things that you need to know to get that fabric prepared for quilting. So I will be talking about understanding grain of fabric, how to get a nice, good edge to cut from, and measurements. Measuring is a huge part of quilting, and using the ruler to in a number of ways to be able to measure the 2.5-inch strip or whatever size strip that you need to have. Um, Cutting with a rotary cutter is a wonderful tool, but there are some tricks that are going to make it easier for you. And then finally, we are going to be playing around using starch, because I find starch to be a really good um, tool to make my fabric crisp and to give me a much more precision with my quilting. So that's our first hour. The second hour that I'm offering, I guess I just have to do this. Okay, is
There you
piecing for success. Um, and so once you've got your fabric cut, which we're going to talk in the first one, okay, how do you put it together? So I stress a lot how to get that perfect scant 1/4-inch seam. What kind of thread to use? There are many thread options for quilters, but some of it's meant to quilt the layers together, and some of it is more intended for the actual piecing. Stitch length and just settings on your machine. And sewing straight, that's real hard for beginners. But what are some things that can help you sew straight when you're doing your seaming? Pressing is a really, really huge thing for success in your quilt blocks, and knowing when to use steam and when not to use steam, and to press rather than iron. And then squaring up your blocks, making sure that things are, all of your blocks are the same size so that they fit together. And then also we'll be talking about borders and sashing, so you can put together a quilt that's square. The third session that I'm offering is called Quilting with Your Walking Foot. First of all, a lot of people don't know what this big hunkin' foot is that they have on their machine or in their box of tools. So we talk about what it is and how to get it on your machine. That's very awkward for a lot of people. So how to make that walking foot so it'll actually walk. And then just the dynamics of using it. What kind of stitch length do I want to work with? What about the pressure that my presser foot puts on the fabric, and do I need to alter that if my sewing machine does that? I show a lot of pictures of various types of walking foot quilting designs. There are many, especially in the modern quilt movement. I go to QuiltCon, and one of the things I really pay attention to is how people use the straight line quilting or the curvy line quilting using a walking foot. And so I have lots and lots of good pictures of that, and I'll probably have more since I'm going there again in a couple of weeks. What thread to use, because you can really have some fun with thread, and then how to mark the lines that you're going to be quilting. So it's a really good introduction to that whole process of walking foot quilting. And finally, the final hour that I'm teaching is on binding a quilt. I find in my work in a quilt shop that there are a lot of people that really seem lost about binding and how to make that binding really look good. So I'm offering this session with the kind of the hints that I have picked up over the years. First of all, how to cut and join and press your binding, and then how to apply it, how to get a really even seam allowance, how to do mitered corners, how to do machine finishing as well as hand stitched finishing. And then the importance of a quilt label on the back, because the binding and the quilt label can go together. So those in a nutshell are the 4 sessions that I'm teaching. And you can take 1, 2, or all of them. And I hope to see you there. It's also a good introduction to, we have a day of basic sewing that Helen Smith Stone is offering at the show. I believe she's doing a log cabin quilt.
Yes.
Yeah. And so this is a really good way for you to perhaps put your foot in the door before you go to Helen's class if you're a beginning quilter. So that's all I have. Hope to see people.
Great. Thank you, Rose. I think it's wonderful that we're offering these beginning quilting classes at the show, because I know when I first was fascinated by quilting, I had several not too great starts at it, shall we say, that it would have been good if I'd been able to access a basic class someplace like the show. It would have been helpful.
And
But
Well, I
I
always
get
tell
the
my
feeling,
students,
oops, sorry, I get the feeling that even people who've been quilting could get some good refreshers from these.
yes,
well,
So
and
you,
I've had people take the class because, I've never had any form. I've just I would go to retreats or whatever. My friends teach me how to do it. But, there's a
right.
lot of ways to do it. I also tell quilters, my beginning quilters, I want you to learn the rules so that when you break them, you know you are. Because I'm
Good
big at
point.
breaking the rules, but once you know the rules, you're able to adapt for whatever
Mhm.
kind of style of quilting that you want. And I want it to be fun.
Fun, and it would take the frustration out of it, knowing the basics. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
I'm curious. I have one question about the walking foot quilting. I have a FAF, which is has a
Has an
built-in
even
walking.
feed built in. Yeah.
Yes. Do you consider that to be equivalent to a walking foot?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
Because basically a walking foot is adding a set of feed dogs on top of the cloth,
yes,
as well as the feed dogs that are in your machine but below the cloth. So it moves the fabric through smoothly. And so you would get less tucks. It's also really great if you are applying binding or something like that, where you're going through lots of layers.
right.
Because it
I
just, it's
definitely
a
use
little
it
more
for
oomph.
that.
Yeah. But yeah, that the even feed foot is equivalent to a walking foot. And I've had a lot of students in my walking feet class where we actually are doing all of this. We have bring five machines or other machines that have an even feed there, because there are other models.
Right, Bernina has one now, and yes, there are several others.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Mhm.
Once again, any other questions? Well, I want to thank you both, Rose and Heidi, for being coming and presenting tonight. I'm sure the the video will be available on our YouTube channel probably within 24 hours, and I'm sure people will start visiting it as registration is already open, so at least to members, and in a few weeks it'll be open to the general public, and everyone has access to our YouTube channel. So that's great. Thanks very much.
Thank
No other
you.
questions? We'll sign off. Have a great evening.